so much. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our second webinar in a series about the 2023 Model Policies for Trans Students. Maybe some of you attended last night's webinar for parents and students. Tonight's focus is really on how the model policies are going to impact K through 12 educators and school staff. We have a great set of presenters tonight. We have Wyatt Rolla. They are the senior trans rights attorney at the ACLU of Virginia. We're also joined by Kylie Hines, Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement at Equality Virginia. And finally, very grateful to have Chad Stewart with the Virginia Education Association joining us tonight. Like I said, if you're just hopping on, we would love to hear sort of where you're joining us from and if you feel comfortable sharing what your role is in supporting Virginia's K through 12 students. So thank you all so much for joining. We can go to the next slide. So before we get started in talking about the model policies, I just want to have a moment of some mindfulness and a message of support for all of educators and school staff who are out there. You know, we recognize that the conversation tonight can be heavy for some on how it's going to impact your jobs or the students that you are serving. And so really just want to take a moment to ground ourselves in this moment. You know, no matter how you are showing up to this space tonight, how you are feeling, those feelings are real, they're valid, and it is okay to feel all that you're feeling today. It is also okay if you are, you know, uncertain about how things are going to look once you re-enter the classroom. But we are here to support you, not only through this webinar, but throughout, you know, the coming months. And so lately, what I've been doing is reading some words and poems of a Black autistic ADHD mixed media artist who I discovered recently. And, you know, the model policies dropped, I believe, July 18th. And I wanted to read to you all her poem titled "If July." And so no matter where you are, unless you're driving and joining us that way, but, you know, feel free to find a comfortable position to sit in, you know, fully relax your body. You can close your eyes if you would like, focus on your breathing. And I'm going to share this poem to you titled "If July." If July was the month when everything happened, I just hope you know this. It doesn't make you weak to feel it again. I hope you know it's okay if it takes time to figure out how sunlight will shine on this. I hope you know you are free to move through this space without perfect words for how you feel. I hope you know that with or without the closure, you are still worthy of the journey to heal. Be kind to yourself when it all catches up to you. May the very room you're in become a breathing room. May the sound of your next exhale be the sound of a small ocean wave finally reaching the edge of the sea. And after you let that exhale go, just let it be, for there will be many more waves after. May the space you're creating right here pave the way for future chapters. And what is this next chapter going to look like? I can't tell you that I know, but if it's anything like the last ones, there might just be room to grow. And not just in the garden sense where there are flowers to bloom and gaze upon, but also in the ocean sense where expansiveness goes on and on and on. I know that not being able to make sense of it all is tiring, trying to hold it all in the human hand or mind. And I know that it is hard to be patient when all you're too aware that the clocks are running out of time. But I can tell you this, even though this journey has stretched you and ran your strength to its edge, you are still free to pause, rest, and heal as you meander your way through all of this. Wherever you can, especially around the borders of the forest, slow down and listen for the ocean sounds. However long you can, let yourself roam free without worry of making sense of everything. You will brush up against the longing to push past the uncertainty again and again. But from the forest to the garden to sea, you will also brush up to horizon line where morning light shines in. So let the warmth of the sunlight remind you, you will encounter different kinds of growth in ways you may never even expect. Let this remind you to breathe deep, unwinding paths as they whisper, you haven't encountered all that is beautiful yet. So thank you again for all that you are doing to support Virginia's K-12 students, and I'm going to toss it over to Wyatt now.
Thank you so much for welcoming us, Narissa. And so amazing to see all the folks in the chat. Please, if you're able and comfortable, keep introducing yourself, where you're joining us from. And I do want to give two quick kind of housekeeping overview things. One, if there are any members of the media joining us tonight, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. Though I do ask that we are recording this and we will share with participants afterwards. So, and happy to provide you our slides. So please do not take any recordings of your own. And if you would, and to not quote anything that is being discussed in this, if you'd like a statement from any of the organizations that are presenting, please feel free to reach out to us afterwards, and we're happy to give you one. And then for all of our participants, love seeing your interest in the chat. I also want to share that we have a Q&A function turned on for the webinar. So just I know you're going to have amazing questions, and just so they don't get buried in the chat, please put them in that Q&A. We might answer some of them in writing, and also we're going to have lots of time at the end to talk through some of the questions. So as we're going, drop your questions in that function so we don't lose them in the chat. That said, we have incredible presenters tonight. Just to give you an idea of what we're going to be going over, I'm going to very briefly kind of give a Model Policies 101, the history of these, some of the substance of the new policies and what comes next. Turn it over to Kylie with Equality Virginia to talk a bit about how to advocate with school boards and school boards' role in responding to the model policies. And then Chad has an incredible presentation on support and resources for educators in particular. We'll talk about some actions folks can take, and then give, like I said, plenty of time for questions. So that's the vision. That said, next slide, and let's jump on in. Okay, we can skip that, the photo slide. Okay, so to a quick timeline of where we've been, where we are now. A lot of folks probably know this, but just to make sure everyone's kind of oriented to the same background. In 2020, there was a law passed in Virginia that required the Virginia Department of Education to develop evidence-based best practice model policies on how transgender and non-binary students should be treated in our K-12 education system. So the Northam administration at that time, that Governor Northam was governor of Virginia, his Department of Education began a pretty lengthy process of engaging stakeholders, parents, teachers, trans students, to collaboratively decide what should be included in these model policies and generate a document that was released in 2021 with, fairly robust trans-affirming policies, recognizing students' restroom and facilities access, affirming name and pronoun, really, fairly comprehensive policies. One complexity was that when that law was passed in 2020, there was not an explicit enforcement mechanism that was included in the law. So what happened in those 2021 model policies were released by the Northam administration is that not all school districts adopted them. I'm sure many of you are aware of that since you work in school districts. So we ended up with this kind of hodgepodge quilt of coverage where we had some districts fully implementing the model policies, some, outright or rejecting them. We had some that adopted the Virginia School Board Association policies that were fairly vague. It didn't really directly address some of the things in 2021 model policies. So that was the landscape in 2021. Kylie will talk a bit more about this amazing tool, the School Board Tracker Equality Virginia has, that can help you figure out how your school board responded in 2021. But then we have Governor Youngkin is elected. And, this is somewhat of a surprise. In September of 2022, his administration releases a new guidance document, a proposed guidance document that would rescind the 2021 model policy. So take those back and use that same statute that was passed with the intention of protecting trans students and fully including them in our K through 12 education system, use that law to actually implement anti-trans policies that he, explicitly frames really as like about parental rights and, limiting restroom facilities access, limiting teachers' ability to use affirming names and pronouns, limiting districts' ability to protect from forced outing. So we'll talk more about that substance, but that's the proposal that comes out in September 2022. Because that's a guidance document, the law requires that the agency have 30 days to receive input from the public. So y'all showed up really hard in those 30 days, and there was a record-breaking 71,000 public comments on this guidance document. I mean, that is astronomical. If you want to go on Town Hall, the regulatory page, and see what some is typical, that is just like exponentially higher. So there's this avalanche of comments, and the majority of which said, don't do this. This is going to harm students. This is not aligned with best practice. We do not support these policies. And then there was a delay, and we kind of, maybe some of you have been following this for a while, and there's been this anxiety and waiting to see what's going to happen with these policies. And sadly, though perhaps not surprisingly, as Narissa mentioned, on July 18th, the Youngkin administration released the final 2023 model policies that, are substantially similar to the proposal. There's really no deep substantive change. Though I do want to continually emphasize throughout this presentation, while those model policies are finalized, the actual implementation happens at the local level, which is why we're going to get Kylie's expertise on school board advocacy and talk a lot about what is still to be done in this fight, because while the model policies are finalized, they have not been implemented at the local level yet. So next slide, please. So again, just to reiterate, high level, they're finalized July 18th. They're rescinding the 2021 model policies. And while that law that I mentioned, the code provision that required the creation of these model policies, that states that school boards shall adopt policies either consistent with or more comprehensive than these model policies. So we can get into the weeds of this, but what that really means is they're not required to adopt these verbatim. There's, like I said, they have to be consistent with, but can be more comprehensive than those model policies. So that's the directive to school boards that is in the statute. Okay, so next slide. This is this is where I really want you, please blow up the Q&A, tell us what you want to talk about. There's a lot of differences between a comprehensive trans affirming set of model policies and what was released in 2023. What I've lifted out here to just have some three kind of focal points for us are things that I think really will impact educators. All of this will impact you because I know you are walking through students with every aspect of their educational experience, but I think these three particularly are things I want to talk with you about. So school staff's use of affirming names and pronouns, the district's ability to protect students from forced outing, and students' ability to access mental health services. So next slide, please. Okay, so the 2023 model policies prohibit any educator or school personnel from using a student's affirming name and pronoun unless, then I should actually put a caveat here, if that is actually the official, if they have changed their legal documents, they have a name change order or some kind of document that has that affirming name and pronoun, and that's the official name, that would be fine. But if that is not the legal name that's in the official record, the only way school staff are permitted to use the affirming name and pronoun is if the student is an eligible student, so an emancipated student or a student over 18, or the parents have provided the school with written instruction to address that student with the affirming name and pronoun. Other than that, what the model policies say is that educators and school personnel are to use either the name in the official record or a nickname commonly associated with that name. Those are the only two names. And then the pronoun, and it explicitly says either male or female pronouns that are related to, correlate to the sex in the official record of the student. And again, that's unless there's written instruction from either the parent or an eligible student. I will say, as a non-binary person, non-binary pronouns are not mentioned anywhere in the model policies. So again, the says actually the explicit sex in your official record or with written instruction, another pronoun. An additional wrinkle here, and I think a real counter to the parental rights frame, is that these policies, and I use the word suggest intentionally, that school staff can what some people will call dead name, or using a non-affirming name, or misgender a student, even if a parent or an eligible student has given that written instruction. It says actually that explicitly that, or the exact words are that no school district shall direct an educator, a school personnel, or an educator, or another student to address a student in a way that infringes on their constitutional rights. So happy to talk about that more, but there's actually a court case pending with the Virginia Supreme Court right now, Vlaming versus West Point County School Board, about whether educators either have a First Amendment or a free exercise, which is a religious freedom right, to not honor a student's pronoun or name. And that's, again, even with parental permission. So we strongly believe that they do not have that right. And I will just name that is a thing that is really prevalent throughout these model policies. You'll see kind of these caveats of saying, like, unless they have a constitutional right not to, or they have to use restroom access this way unless federal law requires otherwise, without any kind of explanation, right? So this is a perfect example where it's like, do educators have a constitutional right to name and misgender a student? Policy doesn't say, it doesn't explain, doesn't provide school boards any guidance. But again, that's what the policy says. You have to have high level, have to have parental or eligible student permission to use something other than what's in the official record. Even if you have that permission, there's a suggestion that school staff that are not affirming of trans people have the right to just ignore that. So next slide, please. The next provision, and this is, just to share with you all, talking to trans young people, this is probably the thing that I hear the most fear and anxiety about, is forced outing of students, where students are not ready to talk with their family. It's not safe for them to talk to their family, and this fear that schools are going to notify their parents that that they are trans, or that are exploring gender identity issues. So what the model policies say is that school districts are prohibited from providing training or guidance to teachers that suggests that they can, quote, conceal information from parents about a student's gender identity. That, again, I want to be really careful with the wording here, because the model policies do not require educators to forcibly out students, but it's really limiting school districts' ability to protect students from forced outing, which is a really big deal. Again, it's like a very big safety concern. I want to name, there is a really narrow exception in the model policies. If you've read them, you've probably seen it. It's not them being kind to trans students. It's acknowledging an existing portion of the Virginia Code that requires, and you probably all know this because you're mandatory reporters, that if a student is at imminent risk of suicide, the parents have to be notified unless the reason for that, oops, can we go back? Great, thank you. Unless the reason for that imminent risk of suicide is parental abuse and neglect, or abuse or neglect, then parents don't have to be notified. So that's a very narrow carve out that's not going to protect a lot of trans people. And I also just want to name that was not any kind of benevolence, that is just acknowledging an existing code provision. So next slide, please. And then the last piece is access to mental health services. So this is another area. There's existing Virginia administrative code that requires an annual notification to parents of counseling services that are available and gives them the ability to opt out. What the model policies do is they quote that section, but then say, in addition, no counseling related to gender identity shall be provided unless a parent is notified and given the opportunity to object. So we should probably actually say, change that word from approved to given the opportunity to object. Practically, how big of a difference that makes between the annual notification and ability to opt out is a question mark, but I do want to say it's singling out mental health services for related to gender identity and as different, and attempting to limit those when we know those are absolutely critical. The availability of those are critical for the well-being of trans students. So those are three big changes, again, that I think really impact educators where the rubber meets the road. But happy if folks have other questions about aspects of the model policies, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to talk about them. So next slide, please. So just to pull back a bit from the nitty-gritty substance and kind of do a political frame before I pass the mic, to remind you, Virginians overwhelmingly rejected these 2023 model policies. We had the record number of comments, 71,000, the majority of which were opposed. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we had thousands of students walk out across Virginia in opposition when these policies were first proposed. Maybe a reason that Youngkin chose to release these final 2023 model policies in the summer when students could not do that. But just an incredible showing from students, trans students, and their peer allies that they did not support these. A second piece, in addition to this widespread opposition, second, I would note these policies do not comply with the statutory mandate, which is that the model guidelines be evidence-based practices. These are not evidence-based. There is no, in the model policies that are released, in the research it cites, none of it is specific to trans people, to trans students, to what they need to excel in an educational environment. So they're really not meeting the mandate of the policy of the statute that mandated their creation. So next slide, please. And the last thing I want to say is that about the kind of general environment here is that our democratically elected representatives rejected these very policy proposals in the 2023 GA. We had 12 anti-trans bills, which I just wanted to say that was very difficult for trans young people, produced a lot of anxiety and harm, even though they were defeated. But they were defeated. We defeated all 12 of them. We had 13 classroom censorship bills that directly impacted LGBTQ youth. All of them were defeated. And to put a finer point on it, 2 of those anti-trans bills that actually passed the House but were defeated in the Senate specifically attempted to do things that are in these model policies: forced outing and ban transgender young people from playing on appropriate sports teams. Both were voted down. So these policies, model policies, are an attempt to kind of push those through this in this executive action of these model policies, where we know Virginians don't want this. They don't express it through the public comments. They've expressed it through their elected officials. These policies are not supported. Next slide, please. And then the very last thing to before sending it over to Kylie, looking at this flow chart, I want to remind you we are on that little purple bar. So Virginia has the law, model policies have been drafted, public comments have been taken. VDOE has issued the final model policies, but they are not in effect at the local level until implemented by school boards. So, we are there is still advocacy to be done. And with that, I will turn to Kylie to talk about what that looks like at the school board level.
Awesome. Thanks, Wyatt. Let me just make sure I got. Alrighty. So I'm going to go through some information about school board advocacy. Like Wyatt mentioned, these policies have been released at the administrative level, but that does not mean that they are in effect. Each school board, each individual school board has to adopt them. I should also, before I forget, reintroduce myself. I'm Kylie Hines, she, her pronouns. I'm Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement at Equality Virginia. In Equality Virginia, we do statewide LGBTQ advocacy work, including working at the school board level. So yeah, continuing, school boards each have to adopt these model policies or some version of them, right? So there's 131 public school boards in Virginia. And that's a lot of school boards. That's a lot of, varying versions of the policies that could be brought up and passed. And, thanks to, or not so thanks to the Virginia Constitution, depending on how you look at it, school boards are highly autonomous in Virginia. And, they kind of have the ability to, draft their own policy. They're receiving this guidance, but they're not, mandated to, adhere to a specific wording or things like that. So they must individually consider these policies, and that's going to look different in each individual city and county in Virginia. School boards are already considering the model policies. We had some, I guess last week it was, popping up in Roanoke County. We've seen some school boards in other parts of the state at least discuss them, either the superintendent during the school board meeting when they were doing their superintendent report, was discussing the model policies, or, they came up during another discussion. And so, it's been not too long. It's been about 2-ish weeks, a little over 2 weeks since they've been released, and we're already seeing school boards start to consider them. And there's lastly, a lack of clarity on the deadline to adopt these model policies. Like I was discussing earlier, there was the laws that passed in 2020 that mandated the Department of Education to create the model policies. And in those laws, it said, or in that law, rather, it said these policies must be adopted consistent with or more comprehensive than by school boards by the start of the 2021 to 2022 school year. Obviously, that has since passed. There was the original 2021 model policies, and there wasn't any additional clarity provided with the release of this new 2023 version. So, they didn't update on when that was supposed to happen or anything like that. So pretty much the purpose of that slide is to just let everyone know that we should not be seeing anybody implement these policies, on a statewide level. It really needs to be considered by individual school boards. And I'm going to actually kick it to our Equality Virginia social work intern, Grace, if Grace is able to join us. Let me spotlight Grace to go through more about school boards.
Hi, everyone. As Kylie mentioned, my name is Grace, and I use she, they pronouns. I'm working alongside Kylie at Equality Virginia, just tracking school boards. So I just wanted to walk you through what the process looks like when you actually go on and view these agendas and assess what's actually happening at your school board. So at first read, or at first glance, you'll see that these policies have to be introduced to the school board. So they'll do an initial reading where it is strictly informational, where the school board will discuss what the policies mean, have their discussions about it, and then later on they'll do a second reading where they can actually take action and vote on the policies, and in between they'll have a work session or time in between to either make amendments or revisions to the policies before taking action to either vote against or for these policies. So to differentiate them, there's a work, regular, and closed sessions. So work sessions are where they just get together to discuss the policies, and they do a lot of their work during that time. And it is open to the public, but it is there's public comment periods, but that's the main public comment, and most of the regular school agendas are where you see action come in, and that's where you can do public comment. And a lot of the times they'll do closed sessions either before or after, and that's where public comment is not allowed. They'll talk about legal advice, they'll talk about personnel matters where it's not really policy discussions. However, that is not always the case. And then there's different types of agendas to look for. There's consent agendas, information, and action agendas. Consent agendas have items that will be mass voted on. So they're kind of just a bucket where they're either all voted yes or no. And that is something that is typically uncontested by the school board. So they just take a group vote. And then information is where you'll see the first readings pop up where it's strictly informational at that time. They're not going to vote on it. And then the action agendas will have where the policies will actually be voted on within that session. And I'll pass it on back to Kylie to talk about our school tracker.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Grace, for that overview of school board agendas. So like Grace said, Equality Virginia has a school board tracker. This took us, we launched it about 9 months ago. It was kind of a soft launch, but it took us about 18 months before that to compile information from every one of those 131 school boards in Virginia. So everyone can have, this information in one place, because like we said earlier, school boards are super autonomous, and that even comes down to how they design their websites, right? And not all of them are super easily navigable. So this is a one-stop shop really for school board info across the state. We have things on there like the next meeting date, when they typically meet. So if they're meeting like every Wednesday or every fourth Wednesday, the meeting time, how to sign up for public comment, as well as, who to reach out to do so, whether it's the clerk or, if you need to follow a link to fill out a form. There's information, contact information for the school board members themselves, all of that information, school board website, where you can find the agendas, virtual meeting links. We have a whole lot of information in here, more than you can see in this photo. So I really recommend that folks, use that link that's at the bottom of this slide, bit.ly/EV tracker, to take a look at our tracker. We are also, as you can see in the photo, we have two separate columns for the original 2021 guidance and the 2023 guidance. So like Wyatt was saying earlier, if you want to check and see what your school board did with the original 2021 guidance, you can do that here. And then as we're seeing it pop up in school boards, the new 2023 guidance pop up in school boards will be updating that, the policy status 2023 column. And we'll also be tracking agenda items to the best of our ability. We'll be trying to keep on top of what's popping up throughout the state and put that there. So, if folks are wondering if there's anything happening at their school board this week or this month, are they talking about the model policy? Are they talking about book bans, things like that? Kind of in that realm, we'll be putting that in, that first column there. So you'll be able to take a look at that. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it back to Wyatt really quickly.
Yeah, just briefly want to share this resource as well. The ACLU of Virginia has this hub, Protect Trans Youth Hub, that I think that Bree's going to drop the link in the chat again, where we have the background that we provided today on like the model policies history and origin. We've been updating exactly a breakdown of the actual content of the policy with a little bit more comprehensive than what we have time to do this evening. And then we'll be continually updated with next steps and what actions folks can take to protect our trans and non-binary youth in this moment, as well as resources as we continue to develop them. So please bookmark that page. It's being regularly updated, and we want to make that as useful as possible for you all. And with that, I am going to pass it to Chad.
Hey y'all, it's nice to be with you. I'm Chad Stewart. I'm a policy analyst with the Virginia Education Association. And I'm here tonight just to give you a bit of background on things that educators and school staff can do to really create supportive and inclusive classrooms and school environments. And also, what are your options and limits when it comes to out of school advocacy as well. And then I'll be providing you some resources throughout. So just to give you a bit of background on where some of my information is coming from tonight, I am one part of a large machine at the Virginia Education Association, where we have a lot of different experts who are working on different LGBTQ support structures and advocacy. We have a legal department. We also have a teaching and learning department, a Office of Civil and Human Rights, and there are a lot of different facets of our work that touch on this topic. And so I've collected thoughts from a lot of my other colleagues and also from our national affiliate, the NEA, the National Education Association, and you're kind of getting a synthesis of a lot of those ideas and thoughts from several folks at the VEA and NEA tonight. So as you can see on the screen, the agenda, I'm going to be going over just quickly the VA structure, so you're aware of how the union operates in your school division. We'll talk briefly about employee protections and what you need to know if you are an educator or staff member in schools. We'll talk a bit about inclusive and supportive school environments in the classroom setting and school setting. And then we'll talk about advocacy opportunities outside of the school in classroom setting. And to leave you off, I'm going to give you some school board messaging that comes from some polling that we did earlier this spring, and also from some of our national communication firms. Next slide. So first off, who are we? We are a union. We are 40,000 teachers and support professionals strong. We're in every single school division throughout the state. We're made up of teachers, of custodians, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, librarians, you name it, all the support positions that make schools run effectively and are essential to operations. Next slide. So one thing I want to be very clear on is VA took a strong stance against the Youngkin 2023 model guidelines pretty early on. we knew that these would not be good for building strong relationships between teachers and school staff, and they would really undermine efforts to create a inclusive classroom space where everyone can feel welcome and have the opportunity to maximize their learning. So it was pretty easy for us to come out against this because there really wasn't much to find in it that we liked from the start. Next slide. And so when it comes to the structure of our organization, we do have a headquarters in Richmond. And within that, we have several different offices that you can see listed here. We also have several committees, including an LGBTQ ad hoc committee made up of LGBTQ members that advise the organization. We have 132 locals in every school division in the state. So for example, in Richmond City, it'd be Richmond Education Association. And we also have 17 districts. So we kind of break up our locals by these different regions, and then they each have presidents. And then we have 21 geographically spaced out field offices throughout the state. And then in those field offices, we have 32 different UNICEF directors who support our members if they have any issues that come up that they need to address the administration with, or through advocacy efforts or coordinating for school board meetings. So we have a lot of different structures that kind of go out throughout the state of Virginia to each school division, and levels of organization that we're going to be fully utilizing as this starts getting rolled out and brought to school board meetings over the next several months. Next slide. And then I'll just leave on the structure section with an idea of our general philosophy. That is when we can support students best by supporting educators. And that's because educators and staff are closest to students. They can really identify the needs of students. It's why so many of our members came out strong against this model policy when Youngkin put it out back last fall. And it was really easy for us to pretty strongly condemn it, because educators understood the ramifications and what it would mean in terms of their relationships working with students. Next slide. So moving on to employee protections section. Next slide. So first thing to know is it's really important by division to know what your policies are when it comes to your ability for different aspects of your free speech, displaying pride displays, having inclusive curriculum, and even what you can say in the classroom. All these policies are different across our 132 school divisions. Oftentimes there's explicit language in your contract, or there could be an employee handbook that has explanations for this. And if you have any doubt, a really important thing we recommend is to reach out to your principal, ideally via email, so you can get the division policy in writing. And you can specifically ask for the division policy, especially if you don't have as supportive of a principal or administration. That way you don't just get their opinion, you get the actual division policy on what you can display, what you can say in curriculum. Oftentimes there's nothing at the division level that restricts you from doing these things. And then the other thing is, if it's allowable by the division, let's say to have a pride display in your classroom, sometimes you might hear from an administrator that you're just not allowed to do that in my school. And that's when being a part of the union really helps. You can consult with your union rep and they can go into that for you and make sure that your administration is following division-wide policies and expectations for their educators and staff. Next slide. Now, one other thing that we want to make sure that all employees enjoy the right to do, especially members of our union, is educating out and proud and being out LGBTQ employees, which serves as great models for our students when you can live openly and authentically at work. There are several federal protections, both Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and Title IX of the Education Amendments from '72. And then this leads to protections from employment discrimination when it comes to promotions and professional development. Also prohibits harassment and hostile work environments. So there are several layers of federal protections for LGBTQ employees in schools. And certainly the union will stick up for you on these protections, and we have a legal team that will also support you. And if all else fails, we're open to filing a claim with the Office of Civil Rights. So next section is retaliation, which sometimes happens when you might be pushing the needle, speaking up against harassment of employees or students that are protected civil rights in schools. And that can happen. The best thing that we recommend is join the union if you're not already a member and you're an educator or staff member. There are layers of protection there where we will work in your favor to make sure that you have all the rights that you are that you get as an employee in your school division. And then also working with you to file complaints with federal offices if there's retaliation just because you're complaining about discrimination or harassment. So those are also layers of protection there. Next slide. So that's a bit about employee protections. And so now we're moving on to kind of creating inclusive classrooms in school environments. And one of the first things I want to bring to your attention is that the Virginia Education Association, if you are a member or choose to become a member, we have modules that you can go through. These are courses for understanding backgrounds of LGBTQ students and different scenarios that you can go through as part of the coursework. We also have additional courses that are a bit more advanced that deal with bullying and harassment in the classroom and what means to be an up standard. And for all these modules, you can get professional development credits for your recertification if you are a teacher, and you can also get, there are micro-credentialing options as well for these. Next slide. And then in addition to that, if you're a member of the Virginia Education Association, you also are a member of the National Education Association, and you get access to several different courses and modules for supporting LGBTQ students in your classroom and creating inclusive and safe spaces for these students. So these are also courses that offer professional development credits as well. Next slide. And then there are lots of different resources, both on the our website, the Virginia Education Association, and the National Education Association. A great one is the NEA Toolkit. There are everything on there from art that you can print out for your classroom of all different size sheets for your printer. There's creating inclusive spaces, there's additional trainings, there's book recommendations. There's a lot more than I'm just putting up on the screen, but it's kind of a composite of all the resources we come up with as a 3 million member union for supporting LGBTQ students and staff. So definitely would recommend that as a first go for a resource. Within that, there's several different recommendations. One big recommendation is just creating affirming classrooms. We know that when you put up signs of inclusion, it makes LGBTQ students feel safer and more able to participate in classrooms. There's a lot of research on that. So pride imagery, safe space stickers, and making sure that as long as you check with your administration, you understand what's allowable by division policy first. Also, you can share and display your pronouns, even if there are restrictions on asking students what their pronouns are. Generally, there won't be restrictions on you affirmatively stating them or putting them out there, which can also signal to your students that you want to create an inclusive environment. So there's subtle ways to go about that, even when you have restrictions. Another thing you can do for creating affirming schools outside your classroom is you can do things like sponsor youth groups like gender and sexuality alliances. I think we saw some participants who maybe were leaders of that, and that's always an option to put yourself out there. Is protected under the Equal Access Act, so these clubs can be started up in any school. And then if you have partners that you can collaborate in your school who want to create safe and affirming spaces, such as a principal or other staff, you can collaborate to bring those pride displays and signs of inclusion and take those modules outside your classroom, put them in the hallway, take module courses with your coworkers. There's lots of options for collaboration and pulling people in to really create a safe space everywhere throughout your school. So you can be the incubator for that. On the next part of some of the recommendations from our national resources and from the Virginia Education Association is standing against bullying. And some of the top advice we see in all these resources is setting very explicit anti-bullying classroom standards at the beginning of the year with your students and covering transphobia and homophobia and how it's just not going to be acceptable in the classroom, and explaining how that can affect people, based on the developmental level of your students, talking about all different levels of interaction of what that could look like. We also have in some of our resources questioning strategies when you do hear students that might make homophobic or transphobic comments, for not just dismissing or reprimanding the students, but trying to question them to get to the root of maybe where their comments coming from and to understand how it affects other people. So that's baked into some of the modules, but it's also in some of the free online resources and the National Education Association toolkit. Next slide. Now, obviously, I think almost everyone, hopefully on this webinar, can agree that we want to avoid misgendering and dead naming students at all costs. We know through research how incredibly harmful this practice is. And unfortunately, the new model policy guidelines from the Youngkin administration clearly lay out that staff and students might have that option and make it very challenging to use correct names and pronouns. If you are put in a situation by your administration, by your school division, where you're expected to do this, there are a couple strategies that we've seen recommended from other states that seem to work. One is calling students by last names, which is always an option. Another is to use names instead of pronouns. So just, it's a hard thing to train yourself to do, but if you want to really create that inclusive space and make sure you absolutely don't misgender or dead name a student, those are two approaches that we've seen work in other places. Next slide. Now, when it comes to bullying, protecting students from bullying and harassment outside the classroom, you have a few options. So you might create that safe space inside your classroom, but you notice it in your hallways and other classrooms, and you don't see people taking action. First step that you can do is notify your principal and the Title IX coordinator in your school. There's always one, and you can ask who it is if you're not sure, but the administration should be able to identify that person. For example, failure to use someone's correct pronouns can be a violation of Title IX if it's repetitive and used to harass them. If you don't feel like you have supportive administration who are going to step in and intervene, it's really important to start documenting this bullying for a formal complaint. Dates and times when you observe it, comments made, all this is important information if you do want to take the next step and file an Office of Civil Rights complaint if nothing's done. And the union will certainly support you. If you are a union member, you can work with your UNICEF director and our legal team as well. Next slide. So moving on to advocacy opportunities outside your classroom. So there are several things that we can do here. First off, and something I'd recommend for any educator and staff member, regardless of if you're in the union or not, is check out the new guide by the National Education Association on how you can speak up for public education and our students. This is a great guide. We'll drop the link in the chat towards the end, or maybe someone will do it sooner. But in it, it goes over general protections for educators, how far your First Amendment right goes in different scenarios, and based on your local division policies, what that can look like. Talks about when you are most protected and ways that you can amplify that protection. Kind of the pitfalls of getting engaged in political advocacy, especially if you're at work, and kind of the dangers around that, and additional risk and potential consequences and dealing with retaliation, because it's not always easy to speak up, but it's certainly needed for our students, and there are ways to do it in a smart fashion where you're least likely to get blowback. Next slide. So there's a lot of allowable free speech. We first recommend checking out that advocacy guide. And then second thing, as I mentioned earlier, knowing your division policy, but also on staff advocacy and media engagement, because some divisions do have strict limits on how you can engage on social media as a teacher as well. Generally involves criticizing your workplace or using a student name. Those are obvious restrictions, but there are some other restrictions. So just getting to know that. And then we always recommend that your best advocacy is done off duty, where you have the most opportunities. You might be tempted to take a lunch break or a period where you're just getting a break during the day to engage in advocacy, but you're most protected off duty. And when you're speaking up at board meetings, it's also important to emphasize that you're speaking as a private citizen. That is an extra layer of protection for you. Generally, it's perceived as by the board as you're not speaking on behalf of the school, and it seems to be effective for disarming any type of potential retaliation or confrontation. So emphasizing that also seems to be important if you are a staff member. Now, as Kylie mentioned, we're going to have all these school board hearings coming up, and we recommend that you start preparing for them now. If you are able to, speaking to board members in advance of these meetings might be ideal, and it's probably your opportunity for the most sway. During the meetings, they're likely to be pretty heated. There's probably going to be media at a lot of these meetings, and board members might quickly kind of draw their lines in the sand of where they stand. So if you can meet with them ahead of time in quiet spaces and take the time to talk with them, that might be where you get the most bang for your buck. The other thing is building a bench of folks who can come with you and be supportive. Administration, principals, superintendents, and other local spokespeople are all important in addition to just educators and parents as well, who are likely going to be at most of these meetings. So thinking about what are other categories of spokespeople that might be able to come and speak to this issue. Distributing talking points, there's talking points from all of our groups here that we're going to be sharing. And then thinking through a media strategy. A lot of these meetings are going to be firestorms over the next few months. They're kind of designed as wedge issues politically by the Youngkin administration. So you should expect probably a firestorm at some of these meetings and local media to show up. So we would definitely recommend preparing to have spokespeople to speak to those media who are media ready and have some talking points on hand, and then even think preemptively about if you want to place an op-ed or a letter to the editor in your local paper or after the meeting. These are just things that are worth thinking through with the team of folks that you're able to assemble to push back on this. Next slide. And then the other thing is, especially if you have the opportunity and you're in a more supportive division, is you can go on the offensive. Your school board might just reject these policies right away. But if you have the opportunity, then you might want to think about pushing for affirming resolutions from your school board for LGBTQ students. So kind of taking the opposite stance. Several school divisions in the state have already done this. We have some sample language at our National Education Association at this link for a resolution. But there's lots of different ways you can come up with a customized one for your division. But if you can, go on the offensive, because certainly there's a lot of psychic harm we know that is done to LGBTQ students when they hear their rights and privileges being debated publicly through policy debates. And you can imagine the same thing might be true for affirmation of calming nerves and making them feel like their school division stands behind them. So if that's an option, go with it. So now I'm going to move into some messaging for school boards in particular as you move through the next few months. And this could apply to state lawmakers and debates as well that might come up for bills next year during legislative session. So our recommendations are supported here by some polling that we did back in the spring of 800 likely voters in the state, and then also some recommendations from national communications firms that we work with that focus on LGBTQ policy messaging. So the first thing we found through our polling on transgender student policies is don't start with engaging with the science or semantics of the issue. When we do this off the bat, especially through testimony or through making a statement, we tend to lose support for our issue with independents. So we recommend not starting there or engaging too much into the details. Next. And then the next thing we recommend is starting your statement or argument, if you're speaking publicly, with a value statement, something universal everyone can agree with. This can be a little disarming, especially if you have opponents in the room. So a statement like, students deserve the freedom to express their authentic selves free of harassment. No mention of transgender students in there, but it's a universal statement that when we polled, almost everyone agreed with that statement. So you start with something that everyone can agree on. Next. And then move right to the problem. So the problem is something that violates that shared value from that statement that you've already started with and framed. So this problem is, this policy will allow the bullying of transgender students. And I underline and emphasize bullying here, mainly because in our polling, a strong majority of Republicans and independents agreed with the idea that they don't want LGBTQ students bullied in schools. It was over 90% of independents agreed with that idea. So it's very unpopular to suggest that something would lead to bullying of students. And in actuality, this policy would. So it's fair to frame it that way and really emphasize the bullying aspect of this policy. In conservative areas, and take this one with a grain of salt, it really depends on your local landscape and what this looks like and your opportunities, if you can move the needle someone across the aisle to make the difference on the vote. But you could frame the issue as an attack on LGBTQ students. We saw a bit more favorability from independent folks that voters that we polled when you used LGBTQ instead of transgender for some of the policy statements we're making. It's a very unfortunate finding, but if you are right on the fence, you could consider it. Another option that you might want to consider next is tying this to larger civil rights struggles. We saw that when you draw parallels and statements to larger civil rights struggles, you also win over Republicans and independents with your statements. Next. So I don't need to go too much into this, but just understanding the details of these policies and how they would harm students, Wyatt did a great job on this at the beginning, but just coming there with the full knowledge that this could lead to bullying and discrimination against these students and not letting anyone argue you different, because that's what it says in the actual policy. And then the last thing, just really emphasizing that divisions are not required to enact these new policies. Only 14 divisions out of 132 enacted them during the Northam administration when they put forth their model policies. And that's largely because there's not an enforcement clause and there's some vagueness in the language around consistent or more than that. So really emphasizing, like, we don't need to open this box for a school board. We have so many other priorities that we need to focus on, and you don't have to take this on. You can ignore it fully. Next slide. Then the other messaging, and this is tangential to what we're talking about, just because the parental rights frame we've been hearing kind of weaponized and used to support this Youngkin model policy. And so I just want to talk a bit about some of our findings from polling and some counter messaging if you do hear this parental rights frame. So in our polling, I mean, we found that Republicans, for the most part, are favored by voters on parental rights questions. It's one of their flagship campaign and rhetoric issues. And it's particularly effective when Republicans use a frame of teachers in schools are villains and parents are heroes, and kind of this villains and heroes frame where they draw a wedge between the two groups. That seemed to, unfortunately, be pretty effective messaging. Next slide. So let's talk about smart counter messaging. What seems to work? The first thing is it's important to communicate what best helps parents and their students. So when we polled parents, their top 4 issues they cared most about for K-12 were funding schools, supporting children, empowering teachers, and keeping schools safe from gun violence. Nowhere near the top of our list, even top 10, were any issues to do with transgender students. It's not the top priorities of parent agendas right now. And so next, please. And so one thing you can do is you can emphasize that these decision makers are failing parents by not implementing this agenda, by not fully funding their local schools, not just any schools, but folks care more about their local schools and keeping students safe. And so you can point that out. That's the real parent agenda here. And then the other thing we found is that if you start with a statement of parents must be involved in education, no matter where you go from there, you win over several independents and you inoculate a little bit against that heroes and villains frame, and emphasizing that parents want to work with teachers generally to improve the educational outcomes of their students, and they want additional resources for their schools, and pointing out all these things that kind of inoculate against that heroes and villains wedge that has been pretty challenging to get over. Next slide. Things to avoid on this. First off is blaming Republicans or Democrats really for this. They're equally blamed. So regardless of who you think is pushing this rhetoric, they're equally blamed for turning schools into political battlegrounds. So we didn't see that as effective. The other thing is dismissing parental rights as a guise or manufactured issue also didn't seem to work well, regardless of if you believe that. It doesn't seem to be effective when you pair it with other messaging and policy statements. Next slide. And then just using the terminology parental rights, that is oftentimes the opposition to policies that we care about to support transgender students. They're using that parental rights frame. And so just not repeating it and saying other words and using other descriptions, but not restating parental rights. Next slide. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is we just have a talking point sheet. I'm sure we will be dropping this in the chat for you all, but it's some talking points and facts sheets on the harm these policies will cause. We link to a lot of different research and studies in there as well, if you just want to read up, brush up on the myriad of harms that this model policy would cause if it were implemented. I think that's it from me. So not sure who I'm kicking it back to.
I can start us off and just say that we're gonna, before we get to questions, it's our last section, then we're gonna open up for Q&A. We wanna give everyone at least one, but you're actually gonna have more than one step that you can take right now to take action. So next slide, please. I think we're gonna start with Equality Virginia sharing some resources.
Yes, so Equality Virginia, we have our Safe Schools Action Network, our version 2.0. Some of you may have signed up for a Safe Schools Action Network that we launched a couple of years ago, but we have a new version. We have a new system we're working with that allow us to really keep in closer touch with folks. And so we have this link to sign up for the Action Network. You'll get information on advocacy opportunities, just general, keeping up to date on school boards, what's happening throughout the state. So sign up for that. And then we also have coming up a school board advocacy training on Tuesday, August 22nd at 6:00 p.m. We have the link there and in the chat for folks to sign up for that. We'll just be giving, some sample comments and outline for folks who are wanting to show up and give public comment. We can talk through how to develop your advocacy story, tips and tricks for public speaking, things to consider, safety considerations, things like that as you're showing up at school board meetings or however you're showing up, even if it's just sending an email or making a phone call to a school board member. So sign up for that training as well.
All right, now just a handful from ACLU of Virginia. Just to reiterate what Kylie and Chad have said, please attend your school board meetings, start following them now if you don't already, and use all of those incredible tips and tricks that both Chad and Kylie have been sharing during our last hour and a half together. Second, I know you all know this, we all have to say it over and over again and say it to everyone in our lives. Please vote this November and vote down ballot. The whole GA is up for election. We need to elect a pro-LGBTQ equality majority in both chambers, and we also need to vote down ballot and really make sure that school boards, because again, as we've emphasized, that's really where these policies, decisions about these policies and their implementation will be made. We need to the best of our ability, elect affirming school boards as well. Third, again, plugging This is at the top of the trans, if you've already opened in your browser, hopefully, the Protect Trans Kids Hub for ACLU of Virginia. This is at the very top. We have an action alert open right now that goes to the superintendent of public instruction, telling her that she should rescind these harmful anti-trans model policies. You know, even if Lisa Coons does not listen to us, I think it's really important for us to keep demonstrating that the majority of Virginians oppose these. We're tracking these numbers. We want to show how many people are upset that these policies were finalized, and that rather than focusing on kids learning in our schools, the kids are afraid. Many kids are afraid to go back to school, and we need to show them that Virginians don't support that. And then fourth, we love all of you, and especially we love all of you and LGBTQ plus educators and trans educators and parents and young folks that might be joining us as well. We know this is a really hard time, so we also want you all to be happy, joyful, whole human beings, and please take care of yourself because we're going to keep fighting, and it will be a long fight, and we need you to be there shining the whole time. So